Ava was 63, a retired librarian from Melbourne who had spent most of her life surrounded by the quiet rustle of book pages and the scent of old paper. She lived alone now, ever since her husband passed away 5 years earlier, in a modest home filled with sunlight, potted plants, and framed photographs of her children and grandchildren. Her days followed a comforting rhythm: a morning walk around the neighborhood, a pot of tea by the kitchen window, and long afternoons lost in novels she'd meant to read for decades. It was a simple, peaceful life. But peace has a way of hiding small troubles until one day they speak too loudly to ignore. It began one cool autumn morning. Ava had been making her bed when she noticed a faint white speck on her thumbnail. She didn't think much of it at first, perhaps just a tiny scratch or mark. But then, a week later, she spotted another on her index finger. Soon, she realized her heels were cracked, her lips chapped no matter how much balm she used, and her skin was flaking along the sides of her nose. She brushed it off as just getting older, the way so many people do. Yet deep inside, she felt an unease she couldn't quite name. That unease grew into worry the day she found herself too tired to finish her morning walk. Ava had always been quick on her feet, but lately her legs felt heavy, her breath shorter, her mood quieter than usual. Climbing the small set of steps to her porch left her strangely winded. At night, she lay in bed with thoughts swirling, feeling restless, but also weighed down by a fatigue she couldn't shake. She told herself it was nothing serious, maybe she just needed more sleep, but something inside her whispered that her body was trying to say more. It was her daughter, Claire, who finally noticed the change. During a Sunday visit, Claire watched her mother shuffle slowly across the kitchen, her shoulders slightly hunched, a distant look in her eyes. "Mum, you've lost a bit of your spark," she said gently. Ava laughed it off, but Claire wasn't convinced. "Promise me you'll get a checkup, just to be sure." Ava nodded, though she didn't make the appointment right away. She hated the idea of clinics, fluorescent lights, and being told what she already feared. That age was catching up to her. Weeks passed and Ava's symptoms became harder to ignore. She began to notice yellowish tones in the whites of her eyes, small dents on her ankles after wearing socks, and a strange craving for salted crackers late at night. Her gums bled when she brushed her teeth, and one evening, while slicing vegetables, she realized her vision blurred when she turned toward the dimly lit pantry. She set the knife down and leaned on the counter, her heart sinking. This wasn't just about getting older. This was her body, speaking in a language she'd never learned to listen to. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Ava finally gave in and booked an appointment with Dr. Matthews, her longtime family doctor. Sitting in the quiet waiting room, she felt a mix of relief and dread. When her name was called, she stepped into the familiar office with its rows of medical books and soft ticking clock. Dr. Matthews greeted her warmly, listened carefully as Ava described her symptoms, and examined her nails, skin, and eyes with a practiced eye. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something Ava hadn't expected. "Ava, these are signs your body isn't getting enough of certain nutrients, and it's not just about what you eat, it's about what your body can absorb." The words hit her like a revelation. Nutrients? She'd always thought she ate well enough: porridge in the morning, a sandwich for lunch, a bit of pasta, or soup in the evening. But Dr. Matthews explained that with age, the body's ability to absorb and use nutrients changes. Sometimes the gut doesn't draw in enough of what the food provides. Sometimes certain habits, like relying on refined foods or skipping fresh produce, leave silent gaps that only show up months later in little white nail spots, tired legs, restless nights, or fading mood. It wasn't an illness in the traditional sense, but it was a slow, quiet erosion of her body's reserves. As she walked home under her umbrella, Ava thought about all the moments she had ignored her body's messages. She remembered the evenings she'd chosen biscuits and tea instead of a proper meal. The mornings she'd skipped breakfast because she didn't feel hungry. She thought about her garden, where vegetables she once grew had been replaced by easy care flowers. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped tending to her own health with the same care she gave to her books, her home, her family. That night, Ava sat by her kitchen window, the rain tapping softly on the glass, and began to imagine what her life could look like if she truly listened to her body. She pictured herself walking briskly again, her cheeks warmed by fresh air, her eyes sharp even in the evening light. She pictured her hands free of white spots, her lips soft, her ankles strong, her mood light. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, a small but steady flame. But she also knew this wouldn't be an overnight change. It wasn't about chasing some magic pill or forcing herself into a diet she'd hate. It would be about awareness, learning the quiet ways the body asks for help, and giving it what it needs. She didn't know yet all the signs, all the connections between a crack in the heel and a vitamin deficiency, between a craving for ice and a lack of iron. But she was ready to find out, and she promised herself she wouldn't turn away again. Ava didn't realize it yet, but the journey she was about to take would teach her far more than she expected. She would learn that the body has dozens of little whispers long before it shouts, and that each whisper carries a story about what's missing, what's overloaded, what's out of balance. She would come to see her own reflection differently, not as someone just getting older, but as a woman whose body was asking her to be its partner, not its passenger. And as her days unfolded, she would discover the 23 quiet signs that had been there all along, waiting for her to see them, understand them, and finally to act. The morning after her visit to Dr. Matthews, Ava woke with an unusual heaviness in her mind. It wasn't the kind of fog that coffee could fix. It was more like the lingering weight of a dream she couldn't quite remember. A dream that whispered, "Pay attention." She sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the faint white mark still clinging to her thumbnail. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "Your body is talking to you, Ava. You just haven't been listening." She'd spent decades shushing those whispers with busyness, tea, and a reassuring pat on her own shoulder. But now they had grown into something she could no longer pretend was harmless. In the kitchen, the kettle hissed and popped, steam curling like a ghost into the air. Ava poured her tea and carried it to the window. Outside, the neighborhood stirred in its usual gentle way, the postman stepping from his van, Mrs. Henderson across the street sweeping leaves from her driveway. The world looked unchanged, but Ava felt different. Every little sensation seemed amplified. The stiffness in her ankles as she stood, the slight tenderness at the corners of her mouth when she smiled, the faint itch of dry skin beneath her collarbone. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and she could finally see the subtle signals her body had been sending all along. She thought about how she had always prided herself on being sensible. She kept her home tidy, her bills paid, her books returned to the library on time back when she still worked there. She wasn't the type to fuss over every little ache or freckle. But this felt different. There was a quiet pattern to these signs, a language she didn't yet know how to translate. Perhaps, she thought, the body was like a favorite novel. The plot slowly unfolding, clues scattered in earlier chapters, waiting for the reader to piece them together before the truth revealed itself. Later that afternoon, she found herself in the supermarket, pushing her trolley slowly along the aisles. It was a routine trip, but her eyes kept drifting toward things she hadn't considered in years. Bags of leafy greens, jars of sardines and olive oil, cartons of free-range eggs. She remembered Dr. Matthews mentioning how foods, even the ones she thought were simple or ordinary, could quietly repair what was missing. She wasn't ready to overhaul her pantry overnight, but she placed a small bag of spinach in the trolley. Then she hesitated, picked up a punnet of blueberries. One change at a time, she told herself. In the evening, Claire called. "How was your day, Mum?" Ava hesitated before answering. She didn't want to alarm her daughter, but she also didn't want to pretend everything was fine. "I went shopping," she said finally. "Bought spinach and blueberries. I think I'm going to try making better meals." There was a pause on the other end, followed by Claire's warm chuckle. "Well, that's a start. Just promise me you'll keep noticing, Mum. Don't brush things off like you always do." Ava smiled faintly. It was true. She had always been quick to wave away her own concerns, but maybe this time she would keep the door open to them. That night, sitting in her favorite armchair with a book resting on her lap, Ava realized she had been reading the same page over and over without absorbing a word. Her thoughts kept circling back to the small changes she had noticed in herself. How her skin seemed drier in the evenings, how her lower legs felt heavier than they used to, how she craved something salty after dinner. None of them were dramatic enough to shout illness, but together they formed a quiet chorus. She imagined them as tiny knocks on her door, gentle at first but persistent. Sleep came slowly. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying Dr. Matthews' voice and her own stubborn habit of ignoring small discomforts. In the stillness, she heard the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the house settling into the night. She realized that her body had been speaking to her in this same quiet way for months, maybe even years. It wasn't demanding attention through pain or fever. It was simply trying to be heard before things grew worse. The next morning, she decided to keep a small notebook on the kitchen table. Not a medical log or anything clinical, just a place to jot down how she felt each day, in her own words. Skin around nose dry again today. Tired after short walk. Ankles sore this evening. She didn't know what she'd do with these notes, but it felt like a way of honoring the small truths her body was offering her. By the third day, something shifted. Ava noticed that paying attention didn't make her more anxious, as she'd feared. Instead, it gave her a sense of companionship with herself, as though she was finally willing to sit across from her own body and listen to its stories. She realized that every clue, no matter how small, was a thread in the larger fabric of her well-being. Ignoring them was like skipping over chapters in a book and expecting to understand the ending. The following week, as she folded laundry in the living room, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass cabinet door. She looked closely at her own face, tracing the gentle lines that life had etched there. Her skin was pale but still warm in tone. Her eyes, though a little tired, still carried the spark that her grandchildren loved. She touched the faint cracks at the corners of her mouth and thought, these are not just signs of age, they are messages that maybe, just maybe, she could answer. It was a quiet but powerful realization. She didn't need to solve everything at once. She didn't need to rush to the pharmacy or panic over every symptom. All she needed for now was to keep watching, keep listening, and make small, loving choices for herself each day. It was the same patience she had once given her library patrons, guiding them gently toward the right book without ever forcing their hand. In that moment, Ava understood that her journey wasn't going to be about fighting her body or fearing it. It would be about partnership, learning its language, respecting its limits, and honoring its needs. She poured herself another cup of tea, glanced at the notebook on the table, and smiled. The clues were there, and she was finally ready to follow them, one page at a time. Ava's next grocery trip came on a bright Saturday morning, the kind of day that seemed to promise freshness and renewal. She wheeled her trolley into the produce section, where rows of vegetables lay gleaming under soft lights. The carrots were smooth and uniform, each one exactly the same length and color. The tomatoes shone like polished ornaments, their skins flawless and taut. The lettuce heads were crisp, almost sculptural. It was the sort of abundance that made her feel she was choosing from nature's best. Yet, Dr. Matthew's words lingered in her memory. Sometimes the most beautiful produce has the least to give. She picked up a tomato and turned it over in her hand. It was perfect, perhaps too perfect. The skin lacked that faint, earthy scent she remembered from her childhood when her father would bring in tomatoes from the garden, still warm from the sun. Those tomatoes had been oddly shaped, their skins dimpled, their colors uneven, but they had tasted like summer itself. She brought the store-bought tomato close to her nose and inhaled. Nothing, just a faint hint of cardboard from the box it had traveled in. It was then she noticed an elderly man standing at the other end of the aisle, selecting apples with the kind of care one might reserve for fine china. He would pick one up, turn it slowly in his hand, then set it back down. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a knowing smile. "You can tell which ones were grown for show and which were grown for eating," he said, his voice low but certain. Ava laughed softly. "And which are which today?" He leaned closer, his eyes twinkling. "The ones that look a little less than perfect. They've had a harder life, and sometimes that means they've got more to offer." She thought about that as she moved through the aisles. It made sense. She had read somewhere that the richness of a fruit or vegetable's flavor was tied to its nutrient content, and that soil health was the true foundation. But she had never really linked the beauty of produce to its potential emptiness. She imagined fields sprayed and treated until the plants were uniform, their growth sped up to meet demand. They looked the part, but like an unread book with a gorgeous cover, they might be hollow inside. In the bakery section, Ava paused to greet Claire, who happened to be shopping with her own young son that morning. Claire listened patiently as her mother shared her tomato revelation, smiling the way daughters sometimes do when their mothers are in the midst of a small epiphany. "Mom, you should come with me to the farmer's market next weekend," she suggested. "They've got real food there. It doesn't always look like the supermarket stuff, but it tastes amazing." Ava agreed without hesitation. Something in her wanted to rediscover that connection to food she'd let slip away over the years. The week passed quietly, but Ava's thoughts kept returning to the produce aisle and the idea that beauty wasn't always a promise of value. She began to notice how often this was true, not just in food, but in life. How many times had she chosen things, or even habits, because they looked right on the surface, only to find they didn't nourish her in the ways that mattered? She thought of the instant soups she kept in her pantry, the glossy magazines that left her restless instead of inspired, the neat but empty days that sometimes followed her strict routines. When Saturday came, the farmer's market greeted her with a rush of scents and colors. The air carried the warm sweetness of ripe peaches, the sharp green note of fresh herbs, the earthiness of just pulled carrots. Stalls overflowed with crooked cucumbers, beets still dusted with soil, strawberries freckled with tiny imperfections. A woman selling leafy greens explained that her lettuces grew without chemical sprays, that the soil was turned gently, enriched with compost from the farm itself. Ava picked up a bunch of spinach and noticed the leaves were slightly uneven, some darker than others. She smiled, remembering the old man's words, a harder life, more to offer. As she shopped, she found herself speaking with the growers, asking where their farms were, how they tended their crops. There was something grounding about these conversations. They reminded her of the simplicity and honesty she'd once felt in her father's garden, back before vegetables were something to be purchased in perfect stacks under artificial light. She bought a modest selection, a loaf of sourdough, a bag of apples with a few blemishes, carrots still carrying the scent of the ground, and a jar of raw honey. That afternoon, she made herself a salad with her market finds. The tomatoes were lopsided, their skins marked with faint scars, but when she sliced into one, its juice ran freely, staining the cutting board. She sprinkled it with sea salt, took a bite, and closed her eyes. The flavor was rich, tangy, sun-soaked, nothing like the pale sweetness of supermarket produce. It was as if her taste buds had been asleep and were only now waking up. She felt a quiet gratitude for this small return to realness. Over the next few days, Ava noticed something else. Eating these imperfect but vibrant foods seemed to give her a different kind of satisfaction. She felt fuller after meals, more alert in the mornings, and her skin didn't feel quite as dry. Whether it was the nutrients or simply the joy of eating food that felt alive, she couldn't say. But it was enough to make her resolve to keep going to the market, to keep choosing food that had a story to tell. One evening, as she sat writing in her notebook, Ava reflected on how quickly life had trained her to accept the illusion of perfection. In food, in appearance, even in her own expectations of herself. She realized that paying attention to what she ate was also teaching her to pay attention to everything else. Just as a perfect-looking tomato could be bland, a flawless day could be empty if she filled it only with what looked good from the outside. She thought again of her body's quiet clues, how they'd been urging her toward this rediscovery. Maybe, she mused, the hollowness she'd felt in her energy and mood was mirrored in the hollowness of the food she'd been eating. And maybe filling her plate with more genuine nourishment could help fill those gaps in herself too. That night, she set the last of the market apples on her kitchen counter. Its skin was streaked with russet, not the glossy red of a supermarket display. She ran her fingers over its rough patch and smiled. This apple, like her, had weathered its share of seasons, and like her, it still had sweetness to give, not in spite of its imperfections, but because of them. A few mornings later, Ava was pouring tea when she noticed the sunlight catching her hands. It lit up every small crease in her skin and, unmistakably, those faint white marks on her thumbnails. They had been there for weeks, maybe longer, and though she'd chalked them up to bumps or scrapes, she now knew better. Dr. Matthews' words came back with clarity. Those aren't just random marks, Ava. That's your body telling you it's been robbed of something it needs. She carried her mug to the table and sat down, holding her hand close to her face. The spots were small, almost delicate, but knowing their meaning made them feel louder. Zinc, that was the nutrient he'd mentioned, and sugar, sweet, comforting sugar, was the thief. She thought about the biscuits she had after tea most afternoons, the slice of cake she accepted at every community gathering, the spoonful of jam she sometimes stirred into her yogurt. She wasn't someone who binged on sweets, but she realized sugar had quietly woven itself into the fabric of her days. The truth was, sugar had always been a small comfort to her. When her husband passed away, she found herself reaching for shortbread in the evenings, telling herself it was just something to go with her tea. At the library, on slow afternoons, she'd have a wrapped chocolate from the jar behind the desk. Even now, when loneliness touched the edges of her day, something sweet felt like a small act of kindness she could give herself. She had never thought much about what it might be taking from her in return. That afternoon, Claire came by with her son, Thomas. While Thomas played with toy cars on the carpet, Ava sliced up an apple for them to share. She noticed Claire's eyes flick briefly to her hands. "Mum, are those the same spots you had before?" Ava hesitated. "Yes, I suppose they are." Claire gave a knowing look. "You might have to think about that sugar habit of yours." Ava sighed, a little embarrassed, but nodded. "I'm thinking about it, more than you know." Later, Ava sat at her kitchen table with her notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote, "White nail spots, zinc loss from sugar." Then, under it, "Less sugar, more real food." It seemed simple, yet it felt like she was writing a private agreement with herself. She didn't want to give up every sweet thing. She still wanted her tea with honey now and then, but maybe she could choose differently. She could replace biscuits with fruit, or have cheese and crackers instead of cake. It wasn't about rules, she reminded herself. It was about respect, for her body, for the quiet messages it sent her. Over the next week, Ava became aware of how automatic her sugar habits were. At the community center's knitting group, a plate of lamingtons appeared on the table, and without thinking, her hand reached for one. She stopped midair, smiled to herself, and instead picked up a slice of cheddar from the snack plate. At first, she missed the soft, sweet bite she was used to. But she also noticed something else. Later that afternoon, she didn't feel the usual dip in energy that had so often sent her back to the kitchen looking for more. One evening, while tidying the pantry, she found an unopened tin of her favorite shortbread biscuits. She held it in her hands for a moment, then placed it in a bag for the church's food drive. It wasn't about punishing herself, it was about removing the quiet temptations that had kept her from seeing her habits clearly. She realized that each small change she made was like turning down the volume on sugar's voice and turning up the volume on her own body's. By the second week, Ava noticed something she hadn't expected. The cravings she thought were purely about taste were also about emotion. On days when she felt lonely, sugar called to her more insistently. On days filled with small pleasures, a walk in the sun, a chat with a neighbor, fresh flowers on the table, she didn't think about it as much. It made her wonder if part of her sugar habit had been an attempt to sweeten the emptier corners of her life. One sunny morning, Ava met Claire at the farmer's market again. She told her about giving away the shortbread, about resisting the lamingtons, about how it felt both empowering and strange. Claire squeezed her arm warmly. "It's not easy, Mum, but you're listening to yourself now. That's the real change." Ava smiled. She hadn't thought about it that way, but it was true. This wasn't just about zinc or nail spots, it was about trust. Trusting her body to speak and trusting herself to listen. That afternoon, Ava made a salad with spinach, walnuts, and grilled chicken. She sat at the table by the window, the sunlight spilling across her plate. It wasn't sweet, but it was deeply satisfying in a different way. She thought about how sugar had once been her small escape, and how she was learning to find sweetness in other things. The crunch of fresh greens, the scent of herbs, the quiet pride of making choices that felt aligned with her health. As she cleared the dishes, she glanced again at her hands. The white spots were still there. They wouldn't vanish overnight, but she felt hopeful. Each time she chose real food over sugar, she imagined she was giving her body back a little of what it had been missing. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a path forward, and she was ready to walk it. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Ava wrote in her notebook, "Today, I didn't eat sugar to fill a gap. I ate to nourish myself." She sat back, feeling a small, quiet triumph. The spots on her nails were still a reminder of what had been lost, but they were also a signpost, pointing her toward a way of living that felt more deliberate, more kind. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was choosing not just food, but herself. It was on a quiet Sunday morning, as Ava stood in the bathroom wiping down the mirror, that she noticed something unusual. The light from the small frosted window was soft, forgiving, yet it revealed a faint sheen on her face that she hadn't seen since she was much younger. Her forehead and nose seemed to glisten, even though she had washed her face not an hour earlier. She dabbed at her skin with a towel, thinking it was perhaps the humidity from her shower, but later in the day, the shine returned. It wasn't an unpleasant glow exactly, but it felt different, a clue she didn't understand yet. By afternoon, she found herself at the kitchen table with her notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Unusual oiliness on face?" She stared at the words, tapping the pen against her chin. Her skin had always been fairly balanced, a little dryness in winter maybe, but nothing like this. She remembered Dr. Matthews talking about how changes in skin could sometimes point to shifts in hormones. That thought made her pause. Hormones were one of those quiet systems you never really think about until something feels out of rhythm. That evening, Ava video called her friend Margaret, who lived 2 towns over. Margaret had a knack for knowing little secrets about health, the kind you pick up from years of paying attention. When Ava mentioned the oiliness, Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her silver hair catching the lamplight. "Could be your body telling you it's producing more androgens," she said knowingly. "Sometimes happens with age, sometimes with diet changes. My doctor told me zinc can help keep things steady." Ava's eyebrows lifted. Zinc again. That same mineral connected to the white spots on her nails. It was as if the clues were beginning to link together into one larger puzzle. Over the next few days, Ava paid more attention. She noticed the oiliness was most pronounced in the afternoons, especially after she'd had bread or something sweet. That made her think about the lamingtons and biscuits she'd been avoiding lately. Could it be that sugar and refined carbs had been playing a role all along? She remembered reading once that these foods could nudge hormones out of balance, nudging oil glands to work overtime. The realization made her want to experiment, to see if changes in her meals would calm her skin. One Wednesday morning, Ava took a trip to the health food shop in town. The place had a warm, nutty smell from the bins of grains and dried fruit, and shelves lined with jars of honey, herbal teas, and amber bottles of supplements. She wandered to the minerals section, scanning the labels until she found a small jar of zinc tablets. She picked it up, feeling a little self-conscious, as though someone might think she was fussing over vanity. But this wasn't about looks. It was about what her skin was trying to say. At the counter, the young woman ringing up her purchase glanced at the bottle and said, "Zinc's a good one. Helps with the skin, the immune system, even mood sometimes." Ava smiled, feeling reassured. She tucked the jar into her bag and walked out into the crisp air, deciding she would take the supplement for a few weeks and see what happened. Back home, she started making subtle adjustments. She added more pumpkin seeds and walnuts to her salads, grilled a small piece of salmon for lunch instead of the cheese toasty she might have had before. She continued keeping her sugar low, noticing that her afternoon energy felt more even. She also decided to wash her face more gently, using warm water and a soft cloth instead of harsh cleansers. It felt good, almost nurturing, to give her skin a little extra kindness. Within a fortnight, the changes began to show. The constant midday shine softened, and her skin looked calmer, less prone to that faint redness around her nose. More than that, she realized she felt a little lighter in herself, as if her body had released some quiet tension she hadn't even noticed before. One morning, as she brushed her hair in the bathroom mirror, she caught her reflection and thought, "You look more like yourself again." It was a small but satisfying moment. When Claire visited the following weekend, she noticed right away. "Mum, your skin looks lovely," she said, leaning in for a closer look. "What have you been doing?" Ava laughed softly. "Listening," she replied. "To my skin, to my body. They've both had more to say than I realized." Claire gave her mother's hand a squeeze, and Ava felt a swell of warmth. It was nice to have her small efforts noticed. Later that evening, after Claire had gone, Ava made herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into her armchair. She thought about how strange it was that oily skin, something she might have once dismissed as a cosmetic nuisance, could carry a deeper message about her health. She wondered how many other small changes people overlooked every day, unaware that their bodies were leaving breadcrumbs toward better care. In her notebook, she wrote, "Skin changes are not random. Every shift has a reason. Sometimes it's the food, sometimes it's the balance inside." She underlined the word balance. That seemed to be the heart of it. Balance in what she ate, balance in how she moved, balance in the quiet dialogue between her body and her mind. By the time she finished her tea, Ava felt a gentle contentment settle over her. She didn't have every answer yet, but she was beginning to understand the language her body spoke. And with each clue she uncovered, each small mystery solved, she felt not older, but wiser. It was as though her body was a long-trusted friend who had simply been waiting for her to pay attention. That night, she washed her face under warm water, patted it dry with a soft towel, and looked into the mirror one more time. The woman looking back at her had the same lines and silver strands she'd had before, but her eyes seemed steadier, more present. She smiled at herself, a private smile that carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who was learning finally to listen. It was a cool Thursday morning when Ava first felt it again, that familiar tug of skin at the corners of her mouth. She'd been sipping her tea, the warmth comforting against the lingering chill in the air, when a faint sting pulled her attention. She reached up and touched the spot gently. It wasn't much, just a small split, but she knew from experience how quickly it could deepen if she wasn't careful. Later, as she bent to slip on her shoes for a walk, she felt the roughness of her heel catch against the fabric of her sock. She frowned, tugging the sock off and running her thumb over the dry, cracked skin. It was the same pattern in two different places, and both told the same quiet story. She had battled cracked lips and heels before, usually in the colder months. In her younger years, she would simply smear on lip balm, slather her heels in thick cream, and get on with the day. But now, with her new habit of noticing, she paused. These weren't just annoyances to be covered up, they were messages. She remembered Dr. Matthews mentioning how the body often reflects its inner state through the skin. He had explained that sometimes cracks like these could point to certain B vitamin deficiencies, the kind you might not notice until your skin spoke up. At the market that weekend, Ava wandered past the bread stalls, the fragrance of fresh loaves curling around her. She realized how often her breakfast had been built on toast or muffins, easy and familiar, but rarely nutrient-rich. The more she thought about it, the more she suspected her diet had quietly edged out the foods that once kept her skin soft and resilient. She picked up a small jar of nutritional yeast from a health store stall, remembering it as something her father used to sprinkle over vegetables when she was a girl. The seller told her it was rich in natural B vitamins, especially B2, riboflavin, which supported healthy skin. Ava tucked the jar into her bag, feeling a spark of curiosity. Back home, she decided to experiment. She dusted the nutritional yeast over her scrambled eggs one morning, the golden flakes melting into the warm folds. To her surprise, it added a nutty, savory note she rather liked. Over the next few days, she found herself adding it to soups, sprinkling it over roasted vegetables, even mixing it into a little mashed avocado for toast. It became a small ritual, a way of feeding her skin from the inside out. Claire noticed the cracked corners of her mother's mouth when she visited midweek. "That looks sore, Mum. Have you been putting anything on it?" Ava smiled faintly. "A little balm, but I'm trying something different this time. I'm starting from the inside." Claire tilted her head, intrigued. "Inside?" Ava explained about the B vitamins, about the nutritional yeast, about wanting to see if her body would heal differently when given what it truly needed. Claire's expression softened into one of quiet pride. "You're really taking this seriously now, aren't you?" Ava nodded. "I suppose I am. I just wish I'd listened sooner." In the evenings, Ava would sit by the fire with her feet resting on a small cushion. She began massaging them with a simple oil before bed, taking her time, letting the warmth sink in. She realized how long it had been since she'd given such attention to her feet, the very parts of her that carried her everywhere. The oil softened the skin, but she knew the real work was happening in her meals. Slowly, over the next couple of weeks, the cracks at her heels began to smooth. The sting at the corners of her mouth eased, replaced by the comfort of supple skin. One afternoon, as she prepared a vegetable soup, she thought about how easy it had been in the past to patch over symptoms without considering the root. A balm for the lips, a cream for the heels. But now she felt different, more patient, more curious. It wasn't about quick fixes anymore, it was about real change. And that change, she was learning, came from nourishing herself in a way she had once taken for granted. She jotted in her notebook, "Cracks healing, skin feels stronger. B vitamins," then beneath it, "Body responds when you feed it right. Don't forget this." The words felt important enough to underline. This wasn't just about her lips or her heels. It was about trust. Trusting that her body knew how to repair itself when given the right tools. Trusting herself to provide those tools without delay. By the third week, Ava noticed something unexpected. She felt a little more energized in the mornings, the kind of energy that made her want to take the longer route on her walk or tidy the garden before lunch. It was subtle, but she wondered if it was connected. If, feeding herself, these missing nutrients had lifted more than just the dryness from her skin. The thought made her smile. Perhaps healing one part of herself had quietly strengthened the whole. One evening, as she sat with her journal, she touched her heel and felt how much smoother it was compared to a month ago. She pressed her lips together, relieved by the absence of that nagging sting. She thought about all the times in her life she'd ignored such signs, too busy or too dismissive to take them seriously. Now they felt like gentle friends, little signals keeping her on the right path. She wrote, "The body whispers before it shouts. Listen to the whispers." Then she closed the notebook, feeling the warmth of the fire against her legs, the quiet hum of contentment that came from caring for herself in ways both simple and profound. She knew the journey was far from over, but for now her skin's cry had been answered, not with a quick fix, but with kindness, and that made all the difference. The first time Ava noticed the flaking, she thought it was nothing more than the change in seasons. It was early afternoon, and she was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes, when a soft itch crept along the sides of her nose. She reached up to rub it and felt tiny, dry flakes lift beneath her fingertips. Later, in the mirror, the evidence was plain. Faint, white specks dusting the curve where her nostril met her cheek. She pressed her lips together, exhaling slowly. Another small sign, another whisper. She dabbed a little moisturizer over the spot, the kind she kept on the vanity for years. But as the day went on, the flaking returned. By evening, she could feel it again, that subtle tightness that no amount of cream seemed to soothe. She thought of Dr. Matthews and his gentle insistence that sometimes what shows on the skin begins far deeper than the surface. Moisturizers, he'd once said, were like bandages. They covered, they comforted, but they didn't rebuild. The next morning, while spreading peanut butter on toast, Ava remembered something she'd read in one of her old health magazines. How flaky skin around the nose could sometimes be linked to essential fatty acid imbalances, particularly omega-3s. She thought of her recent meals. There had been greens, eggs, fresh vegetables from the farmer's market. But fish? Not so much. Not since her husband passed, when she stopped making their favorite baked salmon on Friday nights. And certainly no cod liver oil. The idea of that had always made her wince. That afternoon, she walked to the small fishmonger's shop, tucked at the end of the main street. The familiar scent greeted her, briny, clean, with a hint of the ocean breeze. On a bed of ice lay neat rows of Phyllis, glistening salmon, pale pink snapper, shiny mackerel. The shop owner, a tall man with kind eyes, asked if she needed help choosing. Ava explained she hadn't cooked fish in some time, but wanted to try again. He wrapped 2 fresh salmon fillets in paper, and as she paid, he leaned in and said, "Grill it simply. Bit of olive oil, squeeze of lemon, don't overthink it." She nodded, grateful for the ease in his voice. Back home, she prepared the salmon as he'd suggested. The aroma filled the kitchen, rich and slightly sweet. She plated it with steamed spinach and roasted carrots, the colors bright and comforting. The first bite was a revelation, tender, flaky, with a natural richness she hadn't realized she'd missed. Something in her seemed to sigh in relief, as though her body had been waiting for exactly this. Over the next week, Ava made an effort to include more omega-3 rich foods. She added a small tin of sardines to her pantry, picked up walnuts from the farmer's market, and drizzled her salads with flaxseed oil. She didn't force herself into a rigid plan. Instead, she let it be an exploration, a way of welcoming old flavors back into her life. Still, there were moments of doubt. On the third morning, the flaking seemed no better. She caught herself in the mirror, sighing, maybe this isn't working. But then she remembered something she'd learned from the earlier signs. Change doesn't happen overnight. Just as it had taken time for her body to send out these small signals, it would take time for it to receive and use what she was giving it now. By the second week, she began to notice small shifts. The flaking eased, and the skin around her nose felt smoother, calmer. Even her cheeks seemed softer to the touch. She realized she'd been rubbing at her nose less during the day. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was steady, the kind that builds quietly until one day you realize the problem has nearly faded. Claire noticed during a Sunday visit. "Mom, your skin looks really nice today. Did you get a facial?" Ava laughed. "No facial, just fish and walnuts, and a little more listening to what my skin has to say." Claire shook her head, smiling. "You're really making this into a conversation, aren't you?" Ava shrugged lightly. "I suppose I am, and it's one I should have started years ago." That evening, Ava sat at her kitchen table, the fading light spilling through the curtains, and wrote in her notebook, "Flaking eased after adding fish and oils. Maybe omega-3 was missing. Body happier now." She underlined the words "body happier" twice. For her, that phrase meant more than skin. It meant the quiet, inner sense that she was moving toward balance, one small step at a time. As she closed the notebook, she thought about how easy it had been in the past to overlook something like this, to chalk it up to weather, age, or just one of those things. But now, each change in her skin felt like an invitation, a gentle reminder to look deeper, to care more deliberately, to nourish herself from the inside out. That night, as she washed her face, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her still carried the lines of years lived fully, but there was a softness now, a steadiness that came from more than creams or serums. It came from the quiet joy of honoring her body's smallest requests and knowing she was finally answering them. It was a still, sunlit morning when Ava first noticed it. She was drying her hands at the bathroom sink when her gaze drifted upward, catching her reflection in the mirror. Something looked different. She leaned closer, narrowing her eyes. There, in the whites, was the faintest wash of yellow, subtle enough that she wondered if it might just be the morning light. She turned her head slightly, letting the sun fall across her face, and the color deepened just enough to make her pause. It was like finding a faint stain on a white tablecloth, barely there, but impossible to unsee once noticed. Her first thought was that it might be nothing, perhaps fatigue or the shadows from the curtains. But the thought of liver trouble flickered in her mind, uninvited. She recalled Dr. Matthews mentioning that yellowing in the eyes could sometimes be a sign of a sluggish liver or gallbladder, a kind of quiet congestion in the system. She felt a ripple of unease. The liver wasn't something she'd ever thought much about. It worked in silence, asking for nothing, and she'd taken that silence as a sign that all was well. Later that day, she mentioned it to Claire during a phone call. "It's probably just the light," Ava said lightly, though her voice betrayed a note of worry. Claire was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mom, why don't you book a checkup, just to be sure? You've been so good about listening to your body lately. This feels like something worth hearing." Ava promised she would, though she knew it might be weeks before she could get in to see Dr. Matthews. In the meantime, she wanted to see if she could help herself feel better. She spent the next morning in the small armchair by the window, her notebook open on her lap. She wrote, "Faint yellow in eyes, possible liver sign, look into gentle support." Then she began flipping through an old recipe book that her mother had kept, one filled with notes in the margins. She found a page marked liver-friendly foods in her own handwriting from years ago. There were mentions of leafy greens, beets, lemon water, and something she hadn't thought about in decades, bitter herbs. That weekend at the farmer's market, she wandered the stalls with new purpose. She picked up a bundle of dandelion greens, their jagged leaves still damp with morning dew. She bought a small bag of fresh beets, their deep magenta roots promising sweetness and earthiness in equal measure. A smiling vendor offered her a lemon from a crate, saying, "Perfect for your morning water." Ava smiled back, slipping it into her bag. Back in her kitchen, she sliced the beets thin and roasted them with olive oil and a sprinkle of sea salt. The earthy scent filled the air, mingling with the brightness of the lemon she'd squeezed into her glass of water earlier. She steamed the dandelion greens and tossed them with garlic, their bitter edge sharp but strangely satisfying. Eating this way felt like an act of quiet respect for the work her liver did behind the scenes. As the days passed, she found herself drawn to these foods. The lemon water became a morning ritual, a clean, bright start to the day. The beets added color and sweetness to her salads, and the dandelion greens, though she had to acquire a taste for them, left her feeling strangely lighter after a meal. She didn't know if it was the food, the intention behind it, or both, but she felt a faint clarity returning to her energy. One afternoon, while sitting in the garden, Ava thought about how the body's signals were often layered. The yellow in her eyes wasn't just about her liver, it was about years of small habits. The times she'd skipped vegetables, the evenings she'd reached for processed snacks, the nights she'd stayed up later than she should. She didn't feel guilty exactly, but she recognized the quiet accumulation of choices, and she understood now that changing those choices was less about discipline and more about kindness. 2 weeks later, Ava stood once again in front of the bathroom mirror. The light was the same as before, streaming in from the same small window. She leaned in, searching. The faint yellow seemed softer now, less pronounced. She couldn't be sure if it was truly fading or if her eyes were simply less tired, but either way, she felt encouraged. The small rituals, the morning lemon water, the greens, the beets, had become part of her rhythm. Claire noticed too during a Sunday lunch. "Your eyes look bright today, Mum," she said, passing the roasted vegetables across the table. Ava smiled. "It's the lemon water," she joked, though they both knew it was more than that. It was the shift in how she'd begun to treat her body, with attentiveness, patience, and a willingness to change without fear. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "Eyes clearer, feeling lighter. Food is more than fuel, it's friendship." She sat back, the sound of the evening settling in around her, and thought about how remarkable it was that something so small, a faint yellow in the eyes, and could open the door to such a gentle transformation. It reminded her yet again that the body never truly speaks without reason. She closed the notebook, feeling a quiet gratitude. Not just for the food, or even for the improving clarity in her eyes, but for the simple truth she was learning over and over, that healing often begins with noticing, and she was finally, fully willing to notice. It began one night long after the house had settled into silence. Ava had been drifting towards sleep when an unexpected tickle caught in her throat. She coughed once, then again, the sound sharp in the stillness. She tried to clear it with a sip of water from the glass on her nightstand, but the tickle lingered, persistent as a loose thread on a sleeve. She lay back down, willing herself to ignore it, only to have the cough return minutes later. It was not violent, not deep, but irritating enough to keep her hovering in that space between wakefulness and rest. By the third night, she was weary from the interruptions. She found herself propped against the headboard, the soft glow from her bedside lamp catching the fine lines around her tired eyes. She wondered if it was the dry air in her bedroom, or perhaps some leftover remnant of a mild cold she'd had weeks before. But there was no congestion, no sore throat, no other sign of illness, only this thin, nagging cough that seemed to prefer the night. One morning over tea, she mentioned it to Margaret during their regular call. "It's the oddest thing," Ava said, cradling her mug. "It doesn't happen in the day, only when I'm trying to sleep. It's like my throat has decided it's against rest." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "That sounds familiar. When I had that, my doctor told me it was sometimes linked to low calcium, something about the muscles in the throat tightening at night." Ava blinked, surprised. She'd never connected a cough with calcium. That afternoon, she jotted it down in her notebook. Night cough. Possible calcium link? She thought about her diet. Milk was not something she drank often anymore. Cheese appeared on her table now and then, but not daily. Leafy greens, yes, but perhaps not enough to meet her body's quiet needs. And while she'd been paying more attention to certain nutrients lately, calcium had never quite made the list. Later that week, she stopped by the small health food shop. She lingered in front of the supplements until her eyes landed on a jar labeled calcium lactate. She remembered reading somewhere that this form was easier for the body to absorb than the chalky tablets she'd once tried. She took the jar to the counter, the familiar young woman behind the till giving her an approving nod. "Good choice," she said. "Take it in the evening. It can be calming too." That night, Ava swallowed a modest dose with her supper. She wasn't expecting magic, but she couldn't help feeling a flicker of hope as she climbed into bed. The first night, the cough came but was gentler, less insistent. By the third night, she noticed it arrived later and faded more quickly. By the end of the first week, she was sleeping through without that strange, nagging interruption. The relief was more than physical. It was as though a small but persistent thief had finally been shown the door. She woke feeling more rested, her mornings easier, her mind less clouded by fatigue. It struck her how easy it would have been to ignore the cough or treat it with lozenges and herbal teas, never realizing it was her body's way of pointing to a deeper lack. One afternoon, as she walked through the park, she thought about the odd ways the body speaks. A tickle in the throat, a restless leg, a sudden craving, each one a fragment of a conversation, waiting for her to join in. She found herself wondering how many other clues she'd brushed aside over the years, treating symptoms without asking for their story. Claire noticed the change when she called one morning. "You sound brighter today, Mum. Have you been sleeping better?" Ava smiled. "Much better. Turns out my cough wasn't about my throat at all. My body just wanted more calcium." Claire laughed softly. "You're becoming quite the detective." Ava thought about it and realized she was, not in the sense of hunting down problems, but in patiently piecing together the puzzle of her own well-being. The night cough had been a small thing, really, but its absence felt huge. She wrote in her notebook, "Cough gone. Calcium helped. Sleep is richer now." She underlined the last phrase twice. For her, richer sleep meant more than rest. It meant energy for her morning walks, clearer focus for her reading, and a quiet sense of balance that carried through the day. One evening, as she sipped chamomile tea before bed, she thought about how much of her journey so far had been about replacing quick fixes with deeper care. Moisturizer with nutrition, sugar comfort with real nourishment, a cough drop with calcium, none of it dramatic, none of it instant, but all of it lasting in a way she could feel. When she finally turned off the lamp, she lay in the dark, listening to the even rhythm of her breath. No tickle, no cough, only the soft, steady quiet of a body that, for now, felt heard. And that, she thought as sleep gathered her in, was a comfort far sweeter than anything she could have found in a packet or a bottle. It was a small thing at first, so small that Ava barely gave it a second thought. She was brushing her teeth one morning when she noticed a faint pink swirl in the sink. She rinsed and spat again, and there it was. A pale wash of blood mingled with the foam. She frowned, tilting her head toward the mirror, inspecting her gums. They didn't look especially sore or inflamed, but the sight unsettled her. Perhaps she'd brushed a little too firmly. She shrugged it off and went about her day, but it happened again the next morning, and again the one after that. Not much, just enough to leave a faint, metallic taste in her mouth. By the end of the week, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The thought of gum disease crept into her mind, but she kept coming back to something Dr. Matthews had said once, that gums, like skin, can show signs of what's happening deeper inside. She remembered him mentioning vitamin C in that context, how a lack of it could quietly weaken the small blood vessels, making them prone to bleeding. Sitting at her kitchen table with her notebook, she wrote, "Bleeding gums? Possible vitamin C?" She tapped the pen against the page, thinking back over her diet. She did eat some fruit, the occasional apple or handful of berries, but fresh citrus hadn't been part of her regular routine for years. In the cooler months, she often skipped salads altogether, favoring warm soups and toast. And when she did have vegetables, they were often cooked until soft, their crispness and perhaps their vitamin C long gone. That afternoon, she decided to make a change. At the market, she selected a bag of bright oranges, their skins slightly dimpled and fragrant. She picked up a small punnet of strawberries, a red so deep it reminded her of summer. She even grabbed a bunch of fresh parsley after reading somewhere that it was surprisingly high in vitamin C. Back home, she sliced an orange, the juice running over her fingers as the air filled with its sharp, sweet scent. She ate it slowly at the table, savoring the burst of freshness. It was a flavor she hadn't realized she missed, not just sweet, but alive, almost sparkling. The strawberries followed, soft and yielding, their juice staining her fingertips. She sprinkled chopped parsley over her dinner that evening, the green flecks bright against her roasted vegetables. Within days, this small ritual began to feel like a treat rather than a task. Each morning, she'd peel an orange at the table, letting the peel's oils mist lightly over her hands. Some afternoons, she'd blend strawberries with a spoonful of yogurt, enjoying it as she sat by the kitchen window. It wasn't just about the vitamin C anymore. It was about weaving something vibrant back into her days. The change, though subtle at first, began to show. After a week, she noticed less pink in the sink after brushing. Her gums felt less tender, her mouth fresher. The faint metallic taste was gone. She realized, too, that she hadn't had the small nosebleeds that sometimes came during winter, something she'd never connected to the same underlying cause. Claire noticed the shift when she visited. "Your smile looks lovely today, Mum," she said, helping herself to a strawberry from the bowl on the counter. Ava laughed. "It's the fruit," she said. "Turns out my gums were just asking for a little more care, and maybe a few more oranges." That night, Ava reflected on how easy it would have been to simply buy a stronger mouthwash or change her toothbrush, hoping to stop the bleeding without addressing the reason behind it. She thought about how often she'd done exactly that in the past, patching over the symptom rather than feeding the root. Now she was learning that the body's requests often came in small, almost polite ways, and that answering them didn't always require grand or complicated solutions. In her notebook, she wrote, "Gums healing, oranges, berries, parsley, keep going." She drew a small star next to it, a mark she used when something felt especially worth remembering. This wasn't just about healthier gums, it was another lesson in listening closely, in letting the body guide her toward what it needed. One quiet evening, as she peeled yet another orange, she thought about how many people she knew who dismissed such signs, chalking them up to just getting older or just the season. She realized now that age didn't mean giving up on healing, and that many of the changes she was making were about reclaiming that belief. She took her evening tea into the sitting room. the faint citrus scent still clinging to her hands. The fire crackled softly, and she smiled to herself. Her gums no longer whispered for help. She had heard them, answered them, and in doing so had added a little more color, flavor, and care to her days. It was on her way home from the library one evening that Ava first noticed it. The sun had slipped below the horizon, and the street lamps were flickering on one by one. She was walking the familiar route she had taken for years, but tonight something felt different. The pavement ahead seemed darker than usual, the outlines of parked cars a little hazier. She slowed her pace, blinking as her eyes struggled to adjust to the changing light. The glow from the lamps helped, but the in-between spaces, those shadowy stretches between pools of light, felt harder to navigate than she remembered. When she reached her front door, she brushed it off as simple tiredness. Perhaps she had stayed at the library a bit too long, letting her eyes strain in the dim, late afternoon light. But the following evening, when she drove to Claire's for dinner, the problem was harder to ignore. The headlights of oncoming cars flared too brightly, making the road between them blur. She gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her heart beating faster each time she turned onto a darker street. By the end of the week, she found herself avoiding evening outings altogether. The idea of driving after dark made her uneasy, and even walking the short distance to the community center for her knitting group felt more challenging than it once had. Sitting at her kitchen table one afternoon, she thought about her father, who had struggled with night vision in his later years. She remembered him speaking once about the need for stronger light, a need she now understood. The next time she saw Dr. Matthews, she mentioned it in passing. He listened quietly, then nodded. "It might be time to look at your vitamin A intake, Ava," he said. "It's important for the health of your retina, especially when it comes to seeing in low light." She thought about her diet. Eggs, yes. Leafy greens, yes. But liver? Fatty fish? She hadn't had much of either in years. And while she ate carrots now and then, she knew the body had to convert their beta-carotene into the active form of vitamin A, and that not everyone did it efficiently. That afternoon, Ava stopped by the butcher's shop on her way home. She hesitated before the small tray of lamb's liver, the deep red slabs looking both foreign and oddly familiar. The butcher, seeing her pause, said, "Good for you, that is, packed with nutrients. My gran swore by it." Ava smiled faintly, remembering her mother's liver and onion suppers, a dish she had pushed around her plate as a girl but now approached with a new sense of purpose. At home, she cooked it simply, just as her mother had, lightly floured, seared quickly in a pan with onions until tender. She was surprised to find the flavor less intimidating than she remembered. Earthy, yes, but rich and satisfying in a way that stayed with her long after the meal. Over the next week, she added egg yolks to her breakfasts and treated herself to a small jar of cod liver oil capsules from the health shop. She began roasting pumpkin and sweet potato, their deep orange flesh a comforting reminder of autumn. One evening, about 2 weeks later, she took a short walk just after sunset. She noticed it almost immediately. The edges of the pavement seemed clearer, the shapes of trees and parked cars more distinct. It wasn't perfect yet, but the soft gloom of twilight no longer felt like a barrier. She moved more easily between the pools of lamplight, her shoulders loosening with each step. A few nights after that, she decided to drive to her knitting group. She was careful at first, alert to every light and shadow, but found herself feeling calmer than she had in weeks. The glare from oncoming headlights was still there, but it no longer swallowed the road around it. She parked outside the community hall with a small smile, the relief almost as warm as the welcome she received from her friends inside. Claire noticed too when they spoke on the phone. "So you're driving after dark again?" she asked. Ava laughed softly. "Yes, seems my eyes just needed a little more care, and a little more vitamin A." Claire teased. "You're going to turn into your own nutritionist at this rate," Ava replied. "Maybe, but at least I'm a nutritionist who listens." That night, as she sat at her kitchen table with her notebook, Ava wrote, "Night vision improving. Liver, eggs, cod liver oil. Keep going." She thought about how quickly she had adapted to avoiding the dark, shrinking her world in subtle ways without even realizing it. Regaining some of that confidence, even in something as simple as walking down the street at dusk, felt like opening a door she had quietly closed. She realized, too, that this journey wasn't just about chasing deficiencies. It was about reclaiming small freedoms, the freedom to linger at the library until the light faded, the freedom to drive to Claire's without watching the clock, the freedom to walk the neighborhood under the glow of street lamps, breathing in the cool night air without the weight of uncertainty. As she closed her notebook and prepared for bed, she thought about the way her body had been speaking to her over these past months. Each sign, from the white spots on her nails to the faint yellow in her eyes, had felt at first like an inconvenience. But now she saw them for what they were, invitations to slow down, to nourish herself, to widen the light around her life. And tonight, she thought as she turned off the lamp, the darkness didn't feel quite so dark anymore. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the sort of day Ava might have once moved through without noticing anything remarkable. She was in the garden, bending to pull a few stubborn weeds from the flower bed, when she felt the familiar ache in her calves. She straightened up, brushed the soil from her gloves, and stepped inside for a glass of water. As she removed her shoes in the hallway, she noticed the faint line where her socks had pressed into her skin. It wasn't unusual to see a mark, but this time the indentation lingered, leaving a shallow dent above her ankle. She pressed it gently with her fingertip, and the depression stayed there longer than it should have. A ripple of concern moved through her. She'd seen something like this before, in her father's legs when she was young, in the ankles of her neighbor who often complained of poor circulation. She remembered Dr. Matthews telling her once about fluid retention, how it could happen when the balance of certain minerals in the body was off. Potassium, he had said, was especially important for helping the body release excess fluid. She thought about her diet again. She'd been eating more vegetables lately, yes, but perhaps not in the volume needed to meet her body's quiet demands. That evening, she wrote in her notebook, ankle dents, possible potassium issue? She underlined the word possible twice. She wasn't jumping to conclusions, but she had learned enough over the past weeks to treat even the smallest signs as worthy of attention. She began recalling her recent meals, a salad here, a serving of spinach there, but there were still many days when bread and cheese made up most of her lunch, and when cooked vegetables appeared only at supper. The next morning, she decided to make a change. At the farmer's market, she filled her basket with leafy greens, spinach, rocket, kale. She added a bundle of celery, a few cucumbers, and a generous bag of tomatoes. On impulse, she picked up a large bunch of bananas, remembering how often she'd heard they were rich in potassium. The weight of her basket felt almost symbolic, a small but deliberate investment in her own health. Back home, she set about preparing a large salad for lunch, the kind she hadn't made in years. She tore spinach leaves into a wide ceramic bowl, added slices of cucumber and tomato, and sprinkled sunflower seeds over the top for a bit of crunch. She dressed it simply with olive oil and lemon juice, savoring the fresh scent as she tossed it. She made enough for 2 servings, storing the second portion in the fridge so she'd have no excuse to skip it the next day. Within a few days, she began to notice a shift. The sock marks were still there, but they faded more quickly. The swelling seemed less pronounced in the evenings, and her legs felt lighter after her walks. Encouraged, she decided to go further, adding a small green smoothie to her mornings, blending spinach with banana and a splash of almond milk. It became a gentle ritual, the whir of the blender in the quiet kitchen, a small promise to herself before the day began. One afternoon, Claire stopped by to return a book Ava had lent her. As they sat in the kitchen, Ava mentioned her recent ankle discovery. Claire looked thoughtful. "I've seen that before in people at work," she said. "They're always surprised when it's something as simple and as complicated as minerals. You've been catching so many of these little signs lately, Mum. I'm proud of you." Ava smiled at the warmth in her daughter's voice. "It's not about fussing," she said. "It's about paying attention. I ignored too much for too long." By the second week, the improvement was undeniable. She pressed her finger gently against her ankle one evening and watched as the skin bounced back quickly, leaving only the faintest mark. It felt like proof that her small, steady changes were working, that her body was responding with gratitude to the care she was offering. She felt lighter on her feet, more willing to take the longer route on her daily walks, less inclined to sink into her chair too early in the afternoon. In her notebook, she wrote, "Legs less heavy, ankle swelling reduced. Keep greens daily." She paused, then added, "Body listens when I do." It struck her how much of her journey had been about this, not just making changes, but noticing their effects. The body, she thought, was not a machine to be forced into compliance, but a companion that responded best to patience and respect. That night, as she prepared for bed, she stood for a moment in the hallway, her bare feet cool against the wooden floor. She looked down at her ankles, remembering the stubborn dents that had greeted her just weeks before. They were nearly gone now, replaced by a smoothness that felt like a quiet victory. She smiled to herself, switched off the light, and climbed into bed with the comfort of knowing she had once again heard and answered her body's call. The first time Ava noticed it, she was standing at the freezer with the door wide open. She'd gone in for a few cubes to chill her water, but found herself pausing, holding one between her fingers. The surface glistened and cracked slightly as it began to melt, and before she knew it, she'd placed it in her mouth. It wasn't about cooling her drink anymore. She bit down, feeling the crunch and splinter of frozen water between her teeth, the sharp chill flooding her tongue. It was oddly satisfying, almost comforting. Over the next few days, she found herself repeating the habit. At first, it was just when she made tea and had a glass of cold water nearby, but soon she was seeking it out in the middle of the day, filling a small bowl with cubes, sitting in her armchair and crunching quietly as she read. It didn't feel like a craving exactly, at least not the way chocolate or biscuits had once called to her, but there was a pull to it she couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, as she was writing in her notebook, she decided to make a small entry, chewing ice often. Why? She remembered reading somewhere that unusual cravings, especially for things with no real flavor like ice, could be linked to mineral deficiencies. Iron was one that came to mind. She tapped her pen against the page, thinking back over the past few months. Had she been eating enough iron-rich foods? She'd had some red meat recently, but not much. Mostly chicken, fish, and vegetables. That evening, she rang Margaret for their usual chat. When she mentioned the ice habit, Margaret chuckled knowingly. "Oh, I had that years ago," she said. "Turns out I was low on iron. My doctor told me it's called pica when you crave things like ice, dirt, or even chalk. Something about the body's way of nudging you toward what you're missing, though ice, of course, has no iron to give." The next morning, Ava decided to investigate further. She leafed through an old health magazine she kept in the sideboard, and there it was. A short article linking persistent ice chewing to iron deficiency anemia. The description fit too closely to ignore, especially the mention of fatigue and pale skin. She thought about how she'd been more tired in the afternoons lately, sometimes skipping her walk because she felt heavy in her limbs. It was subtle but consistent, and she realized she had brushed it off the same way she once ignored so many small signals. On her next trip to the butcher, she asked for a small piece of grass-fed beef liver. She'd recently reintroduced liver into her diet for vitamin A, but now she saw it in a new light, as one of the richest natural sources of iron. She also picked up a package of lean beef mince, planning to make a simple stew. Back at home, she seared the liver lightly with onions, the scent bringing back memories of her mother's kitchen. It still wasn't her favorite flavor, but it felt purposeful, almost medicinal. She also began adding spinach and beetroot to her lunches, tossing them into salads alongside pumpkin seeds for an extra mineral boost. At the health shop, she found a jar of gentle iron capsules made from desiccated spleen. The label claimed they were easier on the stomach than standard iron tablets. She added them to her basket, deciding to try a low dose alongside her meals. The first week, the ice habit lingered, but by the second, she noticed she wasn't reaching for it as often. She'd still add cubes to her water on warm afternoons, but the urge to crunch them mindlessly was fading. More surprising was the way her energy began to shift. She felt steadier during the day, less prone to that heavy slump after lunch. Even her cheeks had a faint warmth again, a quiet sign she didn't look quite so pale. Claire noticed during a weekend visit. "You look brighter, Mum," she said as they shared tea in the garden. "And you're not chewing ice like last time I was here?" Ava smiled. "Turns out it was my body's strange way of asking for more iron. I suppose I'm learning its language one clue at a time." That evening, Ava reflected on the strange logic of it. How could craving ice, something so far from iron-rich food, be tied to a deficiency? But she realized that much of the body's language wasn't literal. It was instinctive, indirect, and her job wasn't to make perfect sense of it, but to listen closely enough to act. In her notebook, she wrote, "Ice craving fading, more iron, more energy, trust the patterns." She underlined trust. Over these months, she'd come to see that the patterns always made sense eventually, even if they began as mysteries. The ice had been one of the strangest signals yet, but also one of the most satisfying to answer. Now, when she opened the freezer, she still reached for ice sometimes, but mostly to cool a drink, not to chew endlessly. It felt like another quiet victory, proof that the conversation between her and her body was still unfolding in unexpected but deeply meaningful ways. It struck without warning one night. Ava was fast asleep when her calf seized so sharply she woke with a small cry. She sat upright, clutching her leg, feeling the tight knot of muscle pulling her foot downward. The pain was so intense it stole her breath for a moment. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, trying to stretch her foot upward, willing the spasm to ease. Slowly, the muscle released, leaving behind a dull ache that throbbed with each heartbeat. She sat there for a while, the dark room hushed except for the faint tick of the clock. This wasn't the first time she'd had a cramp at night, but it was the worst in recent memory. The last time had been weeks ago, a milder twinge she'd dismissed as sleeping funny. Now she knew better than to ignore it. She rubbed her calf gently, thinking of all the little signs her body had given her lately, how each one had led her to uncover something she hadn't been feeding or supporting well enough. The next morning, as she made her tea, she jotted it down in her notebook. Night cramp, painful, left calf. She tapped her pen against the page, remembering a conversation she'd overheard once at the farmer's market about cramps and minerals. Potassium had already been on her mind from her swollen ankle episode, but there was another one that seemed to come up often: magnesium. She thought about her diet. She had been adding more greens lately, yes, but perhaps not in the volume needed to restore her reserves. Later that morning, she mentioned it to Margaret over the phone. "Magnesium, love," Margaret said without hesitation. "I used to get those awful cramps until my doctor told me to eat more greens. You know, it's the mineral right at the heart of chlorophyll. That's why plants are such a good source." Ava scribbled it down, already planning her next grocery trip. At the market, she filled her basket with dark, leafy greens, kale, silver beet, spinach. She added a bag of pumpkin seeds and a jar of almond butter for snacking. In the health shop, she browsed the supplements and found a small bottle of powdered magnesium citrate. She liked the idea of getting most of her minerals from food, but she was willing to give her body a little extra help for now. That afternoon, she made a large salad with kale, avocado, and pumpkin seeds, tossing it with lemon juice and olive oil. It felt nourishing in a different way, not just light and fresh, but grounding. That night, she mixed a teaspoon of the magnesium powder into warm water before bed. The taste was faintly tangy, almost pleasant. She climbed into bed with a sense of quiet hope. The first night, she slept without cramps. The second night, too. By the third, she realized she was waking more refreshed, her legs feeling lighter in the morning. She kept up the greens and seeds during the day, the magnesium powder at night. A week later, she realized she hadn't had even the faintest twinge. One evening, as she watered the garden, she thought about how easy it would have been to simply blame the cramps on age, as so many people did. But she was learning that age was rarely the whole story. Muscles needed minerals to work smoothly, just as they always had, and when they were missing, the body made its protest known. Claire noticed the change during one of their Sunday walks. "You're keeping up with me better today, Mum," she said, smiling. "Last month you were stopping every few minutes to stretch your calf." Ava laughed. "Turns out it wasn't my walking speed, just my magnesium." Claire shook her head, amused. "You really are piecing yourself back together one nutrient at a time." That night, Ava wrote in her notebook, "No cramps for over a week. Magnesium plus greens helping. Keep up." She underlined keep up. She thought about how this journey had never been about perfection. It was about noticing, adjusting, and giving her body the respect it deserved. The cramps had been a jolt, yes, but also a gift, a reminder that her muscles still needed the same care they always had, even if the signals had changed shape over the years. She went to bed that night feeling grateful, not just for the absence of pain, but for the return of trust between her and her body. And as she drifted into sleep, her legs rested in easy stillness, ready to carry her forward into the next chapter of her healing. It was during her usual morning routine, standing before the bathroom mirror with her hairbrush in hand, that Ava spotted something she hadn't noticed before. She leaned in closer, adjusting her glasses. The outer third of her eyebrows, those soft, arching lines that had always framed her face, seemed thinner, more sparse than she remembered. The hairs tapered away earlier than they used to, leaving the edges looking faint and unfinished. She tilted her head, searching her memory for when this change had begun. She couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but she knew it hadn't always been like this. For a moment, she told herself it was probably just age. After all, hair thinned in different places as the years passed, but something in her resisted the easy explanation. Over these months, she had learned to look twice at anything new and to ask what else it might mean before accepting it as inevitable. She remembered a conversation she once overheard in the waiting room at Dr. Matthews' office. A woman had been telling a friend about her thinning eyebrows and how it was connected to her thyroid. Ava had tucked the detail away without much thought at the time. Now, it returned with clarity. She reached for her notebook on the vanity and wrote, "Eyebrow thinning, possible thyroid?" She knew the thyroid was a small gland in the neck, but beyond that, her understanding was hazy. Later that day, she decided to mention it to Margaret over the phone. "Could be your thyroid, love," Margaret said without hesitation. "Especially if it's the outer part of the brows. My sister had that. Turned out she needed more iodine. You should have a chat with your doctor, but in the meantime, seaweed is an easy thing to add." The next morning at the farmer's market, Ava wandered toward the stall that sold dried seaweed sheets. The vendor, a cheerful woman with wind-blown hair, offered her a taste of crispy nori. The salty, mineral-rich flavor caught Ava off guard, but she found herself liking it. She bought a small packet and also picked up a jar of seaweed flakes that could be sprinkled over salads or stirred into soups. Back home, she began making small changes. She added seaweed flakes to her lunchtime omelet, folded nori sheets around slices of avocado for a quick snack, and even crumbled a bit into her vegetable soups. She also made a note to use iodized sea salt more often instead of the plain rock salt she'd favored for years. These weren't drastic changes, but they felt deliberate, like small offerings to a part of her body she had overlooked. She also began paying attention to other signs that might be linked. She noticed she often felt colder than those around her, even with the heating on. Her hands and feet were sometimes chilly for no reason, and there were days when her energy dipped low enough to make her wonder if it was more than just a bad night's sleep. All of it painted a picture she hadn't quite seen until now. A week later, she brought it up with Dr. Matthews. He nodded thoughtfully, agreeing it was worth checking her thyroid levels with a blood test. In the meantime, he approved of her gentle dietary changes. "Sometimes," he said, "small, steady improvements in nutrient intake can make a big difference, especially with iodine. Just don't go overboard. Balance is the key." Over the next few weeks, Ava began to notice subtle shifts. She felt slightly warmer, her morning energy a touch steadier. It was too soon to say whether her brows were growing back, but she had the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was addressing the possible root instead of simply filling them in with makeup. And just as importantly, she felt more connected to the process of caring for herself. Claire noticed one Sunday afternoon as they sat at the kitchen table sharing tea. "You look fresher, Mum," she said, studying her face. "I can't put my finger on it, but you do." Ava smiled. "I've been feeding my eyebrows," she said with a small laugh. Claire raised an amused eyebrow of her own. "Only you would say something like that." That night, Ava wrote in her notebook, "Supporting thyroid, seaweed, iodized salt. Feel warmer." She drew a small arrow next to it and added, "Listen to the small changes. They matter." She thought about how easy it would have been to dismiss the thinning as nothing more than vanity or age. But as with every sign before, it had turned out to be another quiet nudge from her body, asking her to pay attention. She closed the notebook and set it on the nightstand, feeling the calm contentment that came from tending to something before it became a louder problem. Outside, the evening wind rattled the leaves, but in her little house there was only warmth, and the steady comfort of knowing she was still learning the language of her own body. It was a late winter afternoon when Ava first became aware of the heaviness settling over her like a slow-falling mist. She sat at her kitchen table with a half-drunk cup of tea, watching the pale light fade from the garden. The day had been uneventful, no bad news, no particular reason to feel down, and yet a quiet sadness had threaded itself through her. It wasn't the sharp kind of grief she'd felt years ago after losing her husband. This was softer but persistent, like a shadow she couldn't quite step out of. She had felt it before during the long, gray stretches of winter, but lately it seemed to visit her more often, even on brighter days. She noticed it in little ways: her reluctance to answer the phone, her tendency to put off her walks, the way books she usually enjoyed sat unopened beside her chair. She wasn't crying, but the spark that carried her through her days had dimmed. That evening, as she jotted a few lines in her notebook, she paused. She thought about the months she'd been charting her body's signs and how often a change in mood could be tied to something physical. She remembered reading about vitamin D, how it wasn't just for bones, but also for mood, and how it was called the sunshine vitamin because the body made it when exposed to sunlight. She glanced out the window at the darkened sky and realized she'd been outside far less than usual these past weeks. Even her morning walks had been shorter, squeezed between the cold winds and her errands. The next morning, she phoned Margaret. "Do you ever feel lower in winter?" she asked. Margaret chuckled softly. "Every year. I take vitamin D now. Makes a difference. My doctor says most people our age could use it, especially when the days are short." Ava wrote it down immediately. That afternoon, she walked to the health food shop. She found a small bottle labeled vitamin D3 with K2 and remembered something Dr. Matthews had once mentioned, that pairing the two helped the body use calcium better. She picked it up, along with a jar of canned sardines and olive oil. She'd read they were naturally rich in vitamin D. At home, she set the bottle by her teapot so she'd remember to take it with breakfast. She also made a point of stepping outside each morning, even if only for 15 minutes. Some days she bundled in her coat and scarf, standing in the patch of garden where the winter sun still reached, letting the light fall across her face. It wasn't warm, but it was real, and she liked to imagine her skin quietly storing it away. The first week, the heaviness still lingered, but she noticed small cracks of light breaking through. She felt more willing to answer Claire's calls, more inclined to step into her garden to check the bulbs just starting to push through the soil. By the second week, the change was clearer. She found herself humming as she washed the dishes, lingering at the market to chat with vendors, making a fresh pot of soup just because she felt like it. One sunny afternoon, Claire stopped by unexpectedly. "You look brighter today," she said, settling at the kitchen table. Ava smiled. "I think the sun and a little help from a bottle are working on me." She told Claire about the vitamin D, the sardines, the morning sun in the garden. Claire nodded approvingly. "See? You've become your own gentle doctor." That night, Ava wrote in her notebook, "Mood lighter, more energy to do little things I enjoy. Keep taking vitamin D and getting sun." She underlined keep. She knew from experience now that small habits could fade if she wasn't deliberate, and she didn't want to lose the light she'd regained. As she closed the notebook, she reflected on the journey she'd taken over these months. Each sign, from the white spots on her nails to this quiet sadness, had been a whisper, a nudge, an invitation. She had answered each one not with panic, but with curiosity and care. And in doing so, she had begun to rebuild a trust with her own body that felt steadier and deeper than anything she'd known before. The sadness had not vanished entirely. Life would always have its seasons, but now she felt better equipped to meet it. She could step into the light, both literally and figuratively, and know that even the smallest shifts in her care could change the color of her days. That night, as she turned out the light and settled under the covers, the feeling was not one of heaviness, but of quiet warmth, the kind that comes from listening well, tending gently, and knowing you are, at last, on your own side. When Ava first began noticing those small, curious changes, a white speck on her nail, a little more shine on her skin, a twinge in her legs, she thought they were just the normal companions of aging. But month by month, sign by sign, she discovered something far more important. Her body wasn't simply getting older. It was speaking to her, whispering, asking for care in ways she had never truly heard before. From the early days of cracked heels and tired eyes, to learning why a faint yellow in the whites of her eyes mattered, Ava's journey became a gentle investigation into her own well-being. She learned to connect her cravings to missing nutrients, her mood to the sun, her swollen ankles to the foods on her plate. Each change wasn't a punishment, it was an invitation. And with each invitation, Ava said yes. Yes to nourishing herself with food that gave more than it took. Yes to listening when something felt different. Yes to making small changes that over time restored energy, clarity, and confidence. Her story isn't about perfection or chasing youth. It's about reclaiming the quiet partnership between you and your body, one small act of listening at a time. So if you've been telling yourself that what you're feeling is just age, pause. Look again. Ask what your body might be trying to say. You might find, like Ava did, that even the smallest changes, a better breakfast, a few minutes in the sun, an extra handful of greens, can open the door to a richer, more vibrant life. Your body has been speaking to you all along. The question is, are you ready to listen?